Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from Antiwar.com. This is Anti-War News for Friday, March 3rd, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of Antiwar.com today is some sad news. Daniel Ellsberg, the whistleblower who leaked the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, he's been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and he's been given only 3 to 6 months to live. So he wrote a letter, delivering this sad news that we published at antiwar.com because he's a huge hero to us, and he's a friend of Eric Garris, who runs the site. And right now he's feeling good. It's a very positive, upbeat letter. He says he's not doing chemotherapy. He says it offered no promise, which means, I guess, they told him there was little chance it would help. So he's feeling good, but he's going to go into hospice care when needed. If you're not familiar with him, go check out his books. He wrote a memoir about leaking the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, and he's written The Doomsday Machine, which is a book about nuclear weapons. He's a very dedicated anti-war, anti-nuclear weapons activist. Just such an important figure. It's going to be a huge loss. But he's 91 years old. He's lived a very full life. And he's done a lot of things that few people can say they have done. He's really made an impact on this world. So go read the letter and say a prayer for him if you're the praying type. Anyway, the next story here at antiwar.com. The U.S. Army is preparing to win a war with China over Taiwan. So U.S. Army Secretary Christine Wormuth said this week that the U.S. must prepare to win a future war with China over Taiwan by beefing up its military deployments in the region. So this is Wormuth. She said this at an American Enterprise Institute event. She said, quote, "I personally am not of the view that an amphibious invasion of Taiwan is imminent, but we obviously have to prepare to be prepared to fight and win that war," end quote. Her plan would involve sending more troops and advanced weapons into the region, including hypersonic missiles. She said the buildup would be an effort to deter war with China. That's the talking point we always hear. They want to deter China. But we see, as I always cover, how China has been increasing its military activity in the region, specifically around Taiwan, in response to U.S. actions, to the U.S. increasing military support for Taiwan and just increasing ties and increasing its presence there. So Wormuth laid out 3 ways that the U.S. Army would work to build up forces in the region. First, by increasing cooperation with allies, which is a big part of the Biden administration strategy. Second, the Army will establish what they call theater distribution centers to pre-position weapons and other supplies in the region. She named Australia and Japan as 2 places where they could store these weapons, and she said non-lethal equipment might be stored in the Philippines and Singapore. The third aspect of the plan would be to place more visible combat forces in the region. She said her goal is to have Army forces in the Indo-Pacific 7 to 8 months out of the year. And when war does break out, if her plan for deterrence, does not deter but provokes, she said that the Army's role would be to establish staging bases for Navy, Marines, and Air Force forces, and to provide intra-theater sustainment. It sounds like, there's some ideas for the Army to be ferrying weapons, supplies around. And they are purchasing more watercraft to do things like that. But she also said the U.S. Army is going to have a role to play in the United States, in the homeland. She said, quote, "If we got into a major war with China, the United States homeland would be at risk as well, with both kinetic and non-kinetic attacks, whether it's cyber attacks on the power grid or on pipelines. The United States Army, I have no doubt, will be called to provide defense support to civil authorities," end quote. When asked if the American public could sustain the level of casualties that would come with a war with China, She said they could, just like we did during World War II, is how she put it. But something she didn't mention, at least I didn't see her mention in the write ups of her little talk at this event, was the risk of nuclear war, because both the U.S. and China have nuclear weapons, and that means a potential war between them would be catastrophic for the entire world. It should be avoided at it shouldn't be fought, a war between the US China because of that. And it doesn't have to be fought. But Wormuth is the latest US official to openly discuss the fact that the US is preparing for war with China. Earlier this year, a 4-star Air Force general predicted the US will be at war with China within 2 years and ordered his forces to be prepared. That was General Mike Minihan, who is the head of Air Mobility Command in the US Air Force. So again, a lot of them speak as if it's an inevitability. Wormuth here, so she's the Army secretary. She's the civilian official in charge of the Army. Not so much speaking as it's an inevitability, but still, they're preparing to fight and win a war with China over Taiwan. And I didn't even mention in the article the policy of strategic ambiguity that the U.S. has followed since 1979, when they severed diplomatic relations with Taipei. That they don't say one way or another if the U.S. is going to intervene if China makes a move on Taiwan. President Biden, though, has said a few times now that he would intervene and that deploy American forces, U.S. men and women, to fight China for the island. And here is the Secretary of the Army saying the same thing. All right, the next one here. The State Department approves a $619 million arms sale for Taiwan. So there's a few things about Taiwan here. The State Department, they approved this deal, and it is, again, worth $619 million for hundreds of missiles to arm Taiwan's U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets. The approval of the deal notifies Congress and begins a period where the sale could be blocked. But it's not going to have a problem getting through Congress because there's all this strong bipartisan support for arming Taiwan. So according to the Pentagon's agency that reports these weapon sales, this deal includes 200 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles and 100 AGM high-speed anti-radiation missiles. Those are the HARM missiles, and the U.S. has sent some of those to Ukraine. And other related equipment. There's some training missiles in there and some launchers. And the principal contractors for the deal are Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. Lockheed Martin is currently building new F-16s for Taiwan that were part of a purchase finalized in 2020 for 66 fighter jets worth about $8 billion. The new F-16s are expected to be delivered in a few years. So that was one of the major arms sales for Taiwan that Trump pushed through. The U.S. has been selling Taiwan F-16s for a while, fighter jets for a while. I believe it was George H.W. Bush that first, approved a sale like that. But, we're really increasing things in recent years. The U.S. has always sold weapons to Taiwan since 1979, that year that they officially severed diplomatic relations with Taipei. But the arms sales have spiked in recent years as the U.S. has become more hawkish toward Beijing. According to the Wall Street Journal, since 2019, the U.S. has approved more than $20 billion in military aircraft, Javelin and Stinger missiles, howitzers, and other munitions to Taiwan. China is strongly opposed to these arms sales, and they denounced this latest deal. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning said, quote, "Such sales undermine China's sovereignty and security interests and harm China-U.S. relations and peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. China firmly opposes this," end quote. All right, the next one here. A House bill would allow the U.S. to lend weapons to Taiwan. Representative Michelle Steele, a Republican from California, on Wednesday, she introduced a bill in the House that would allow the U.S. to lend or lease weapons to Taiwan. This is as Congress is looking for more ways to ship arms to the island. The legislation is modeled off the World War II era Lend-Lease Act that allowed the U.S. to arm the Soviet Union, Britain, and other allies prior to its entry in the war. So this is very symbolic, I think, of the way that they're viewing the situation in Taiwan. A similar law was passed for Ukraine. After Russia invaded, they passed a Lend-Lease Act for Ukraine. You know, they call it the Lend-Lease Act, referring to that law passed when the Britain and the Soviet Union was fighting Germany. Similar law. Sorry, I just repeated myself. But Biden signed that into law last year. I'm not sure if they've used it. It would allow the U.S. to lend weapons to Ukraine and collect a payment at a further date, because they've gotten all this money authorized for military aid. You know, they didn't need it, but maybe, I don't know, maybe they have sent extra weapons using this. And who knows if they're actually going to collect payment for it. I'm sure they didn't get payment from the Soviet Union for all the stuff they sent them. But versions of the bill for Taiwan were introduced in both the House and the Senate last year. So there was an effort at this last year, but they were never put to the floor for a vote. But this Congress seems to be very gung-ho about the China stuff, so we'll see what happens with this. But Steele wrote on Twitter, quote, "I am reintroducing the Taiwan Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act to arm Taiwan with the tools it needs to defend itself and deter a CCP invasion," end quote. So she claimed in comments to the Washington Times, she called China the greatest threat to global stability and America's national security. So far, her bill has received 12 bipartisan co-sponsors, 4 Democrats and 8 Republicans. So Congress has been scrambling for ways to get more weapons in Taiwan's hands in the name of deterrence, as I discussed this already, just how increasing military support for Taiwan has led to more Chinese military pressure on the island. For example, the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act, it included $2 billion in military aid for Taiwan in the form of loans to finance weapons purchases. In response, when Biden signed this, China launched major military exercises around Taiwan, and they said it was in response to this increasing U.S. Military support for Taiwan. So, you know, they call it deterrence, but, you know, it's really provocation. All right, the next one here is from the South China Morning Post. China and the U.S. flex their military might around Taiwan as tensions flare between rivals. So China and the United States have flexed their military might around Taiwan over the past 3 days. The People's Liberation Army, that's the Chinese military, they've sent 68 aircraft and 10 warships in areas around Taiwan since Monday. According to the island's defense ministry, while the U.S. confirmed its P-8A Poseidon reconnaissance plane had been deployed to fly through the Taiwan Strait. That was that U.S. spy plane that flew over the strait the other day. And online flight checking platforms showed that the U.S. had also sent aerial refueling aircraft and bombers near the area. So more U.S. flights than we've heard about. The Chinese military jets were deployed just after the U.S. Navy announced that they sent the surveillance plane through the Taiwan Strait. So again, you know, it's just an example of the tensions in the region and the increasing military activity from both the U.S. and China. Okay, the next one here. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has finally held an in-person meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, over 1 year after Russia invaded Ukraine. So this was at the sidelines of the G20 summit in New Delhi, India. Blinken had a brief chat with Lavrov. It was very short. They spoke for less than 10 minutes, and there was no sign that any breakthrough was made. According to Blinken's account, he told Lavrov that Russia should stop fighting in Ukraine and resume participation in New START, which is the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the two powers. Blinken also said that he discussed Paul Whelan, who is a former U.S. Marine who was arrested on spying charges in Moscow, and he was handed a 16-year sentence in 2020. Blinken said that the U.S. has put forward a proposal to exchange Whelan and that Moscow should accept it. The Russian Foreign Ministry said that the two diplomats held talks on the go and that it was not long enough to be considered a negotiation. So this is Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova. This is the Russian account of the short meeting. She said, quote, Blinken asked for a contact with Lavrov. Lavrov had communication on the go during the second session, but there were no negotiations, no meeting, or so on, end quote. In comments after the G20 meeting, Lavrov criticized Western countries that participated in the summit and only alluded to his talk with Blinken. Lavrov said, quote, "They decided not to communicate with us. This is their choice. Although when our paths cross in the corridors and on the sidelines of events like the one today, not everyone manages to turn away and run past," end quote. So this brief meeting marked only the second time that Blinken spoke with Lavrov since the invasion. In July 2022, they held a phone call, but Blinken said that they only discussed a prisoner swap. That was the Griner bout swap that eventually happened. That's what they talked about, not the war in Ukraine. That's what Blinken made a point to say that, no, I didn't, try to negotiate any sort of ceasefire or anything. We just talked about that. So Blinken and Lavrov, were talking in the months leading up to Russia's invasion, going back to 2022. But Blinken canceled a meeting with Lavrov right before the invasion in response to Putin recognizing the independence of the Donbass republics. So if you remember, right before the invasion, it started with Putin recognizing Donetsk and Luhansk, the people's republics there that broke away, tried to break away from Ukraine in 2014 after the U.S.-backed coup. Ukraine wasn't having it, and they launched a war. So there was a civil war going on in the Donbass since then. It actually flared up right before Russia invaded. There was a lot of fighting going on, so it's something, of course, a lot of people in the mainstream press don't ever cover, is the fact that there was this war going on for 8 years before, Russia, the next phase of it, which was the Russian invasion. But right before, Putin said he recognized their independence, he never did it before that, even though they asked him to. And he announced the deployment of, quote unquote, peacekeeping troops to these Donbass republics. So right after that, Blinken, didn't think, oh, maybe I should get on the phone and see what, we could try to do to prevent this war. This new phase of the war. Blinken cut off contact with Lavrov. He said, can't talk to him now. And then, avoided him at other G20 summits. The State Department was saying for months that now is not the time, for them to talk. So that's just the kind of diplomat that Tony Blinken is. But who knows? Maybe they talked about something else that they didn't mention publicly. It's still good. Overall, I think we should always encourage diplomacy and welcome news of, talks like that. All right, the next one. Russia says that Ukrainian saboteurs launched an attack in Russia's Bryansk Oblast, which borders Ukraine. They said these saboteurs launched attacks on villages in the area and said 2 civilians were killed. Now, Ukrainian officials denied involvement in the attack and suggested that Russians might have been responsible. So this is strange. A group known as the Russian Volunteer Corps took credit for the attack. They denied the reports of civilian casualties. So I don't know much about this Russian Volunteer Corps, but from what I understand, they're Russians who have been fighting for Ukraine for a long time now. According to the Ukrainian news site, this is the only information I could find on them. So, there wasn't much out there, but this is according to Glavcom, which is a Ukrainian news site. They described the Russian Volunteer Corps as a group of Russian right-wing volunteers formed in August 2022 who have been fighting for Ukraine since 2014. Said members of the Russian Volunteer Corps have fought in other Ukrainian military units, including the Azov Regiment, which is, the infamous neo-Nazi, started as a neo-Nazi militia that became part of the Ukrainian National Guard. And, they were described as a neo-Nazi regiment, a neo-Nazi battalion, again, before Russia invaded, even by the Western media. There was efforts in Congress to make sure that U.S. aid to Ukraine didn't end up in their hands. But since then, they've been whitewashed by the media and kind of rebranded. But anyway, so they're saying that these Russians who fight for Ukraine were fought for, said several military units, but including Azov. So and they're part of the Territorial Defense Forces of Ukraine, which is volunteer fighters that are part of the Ukrainian military. It's like a reserve force. So in a Telegram post, the Russian Volunteer Corps, they did say that they entered Russian territory from Ukraine. And these claims aren't confirmed. Again, they denied the civilian casualties. They said that they went there to show the Russian people that there is hope. You know, they're anti-Putin, obviously. So their claims aren't confirmed, and I haven't seen Russian officials mention them. You know, they said, you know, they blamed Ukrainian saboteurs, and Putin called the incident a terrorist attack and said that the perpetrators intentionally targeted civilians. He compared the attack to the killing of Daria Dugina, who was killed in a car bombing outside of Moscow. She's the daughter of Alexander Dugin, who's a Russian philosopher. And again, she was killed. I forget exactly when that happened, maybe over the summer. She was killed in a car bombing outside of Moscow, and U.S. intelligence believed that the Ukrainian government was behind that. So, you know, it's kind of a strange situation with this one group claiming it. So we'll see if this develops anymore. If Russia does say that it was indeed this Russian volunteer corps. All right. So the next one here, Russia says that it suspended New START because of its attacks on strategic sites. So Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said Thursday that one of the reasons Russia suspended its participation in the New START treaty was because the U.S. helped Ukraine attack a facility housing Russian nuclear weapons. New START is the last nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia, and it limits the deployment of warheads and launchers, including heavy bombers that are assigned to nuclear missions. So Ryabkov is saying that Ukraine launched attacks on facilities declared under this treaty that the U.S. would know about. He said, quote, "The situation was further escalated by U.S. attempts to probe the security of Russian strategic facilities declared under New START by helping the Kiev regime to carry out armed attacks on them," end quote. He said that this at the Conference of Disarmament in Geneva. In December, Ukrainian drones targeted the Engels airfield. So this is an airfield a few hundred miles, you know, from the Ukrainian border. It was one of the deepest Ukrainian attacks of the war. And at this Engel airfield, there were Russian strategic bombers that are capable of carrying nuclear warheads. Although I don't know if it's clear if they were carrying nuclear warheads at the time of this attack. I'm not sure this is exactly what Ryabkov is referring to, but it reminded me of this. And NATO military sources told Asia Times that in these attacks, Ukraine used drones that used U.S. satellite GPS data to hit their targets. Ryabkov said that Ukraine would not be able to target Russian infrastructure without help from the U.S. He also said that even though Russia suspended its participation in the treaty, they're still going to keep abiding by the treaty's limits, which is good to hear. So this treaty is probably still, in effect. The way things stand right now, again, Russia told the U.S. that they were suspending participation, but they're saying they're still going to follow it. And the inspections haven't been going on since 2020, so it's kind of seems like it's still the same situation when it comes to Russia's deployment of its nuclear forces. And Ryabkov also warned that U.S. support for Ukraine could lead to a direct clash between nuclear powers. He said the U.S. and NATO's increasing involvement in the war could result in a fraught, direct military clash of nuclear powers with catastrophic consequences. All right. The next one here, Israel says that its window to attack Iran is closing due to potential Russian support. So Israeli officials are claiming that Russia might provide Iran with S-400 air defense systems. And because of that, they're saying that Israel's window to launch an attack on Iran is closing. And this is according to a report from Bloomberg that cited anonymous people in the U.S. and Israel who said the prospect of Iran acquiring the S-400 system could accelerate plans for an Israeli attack. And Russia and Iran, they have vowed to increase cooperation. It's not clear, Russia hasn't said that they're going to give Iran these S-400 systems. So But anyway, Israeli officials are saying that they will, and this is part of their threats against Iran. And they've been openly threatening to attack Iran, for a long time, but more so recently. They've really stepped up their threats, including Netanyahu. And Netanyahu recently said Israel is running out of time to attack Iran. He said the longer you wait, the harder it's going to be. And these threats are focused on Iran's nuclear program, even though the Pentagon and the CIA have recently acknowledged that Iran is not trying to build a nuclear bomb. And while these Israeli officials are making constant threats, the U.S. has essentially given them the green light to attack Iran based on what Tom Nide said, who is the U.S. ambassador to Israel. He said in February that Israel can and should do whatever they need against Iran, and said that the U.S. has got their back. And these comments came a few weeks after an Israeli drone attack hit a facility in the Iranian city of Isfahan. And the U.S. and Israel recently, they've really stepped up their military cooperation, and they will launch their largest ever joint military drills in January, known as Juniper Oak 23, which involved massive live fire exercises over Israel and the Mediterranean Sea. So this tensions are really high. I know it's not what many people are paying attention to, but between the U.S., Iran, and Israel, and this is something I've been following very closely for a few years, and it does seem like, there's a real chance that something could happen here. Now, there's always the question of are they actually capable of bombing Iran? That's not really clear without U.S. support. But again, it's just, if something like that happened, I mean, man, it would just throw the whole region into a huge war, and it would be another part of, what's starting to look like World War III. But that's it. Oh, actually, there's another one here. This is actually from the Gray Zone, and it's about the European anti-war protests. So if you want to check out more information on that, it's a good article. There's also anti-NATO protests in Greece. In the Czech Republic, not just Germany and France, so all over. So there's a lot of pressure on the European NATO countries to stop supporting this war, which I think is a really encouraging sign. And I just left up the one from yesterday about the House voting to keep sanctions on Syria after the earthquake, just because it's so unbelievable. Anyway, that's it for the news. Go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Ted Snyder about Cuba, the coming battle for the liberation of Cuba. We have one from Caitlin Johnstone, the historic urgency for an anti-war movement. Go check that out. Let's see. One from Ramsey Baroud, false hopes and broken promises, the UN statement on Palestine. One from D. Knight, Dr. Strangelove is no longer satire. And then our spotlight is the letter from Daniel Ellsberg. Again, please go check that out. And he titled it "Living on a Deadline in the Nuclear Age." And fortunately, a lot of his warnings were not heeded. But that is it for me for the whole week. I'll be back after the weekend. Support the show, support antiwar.com, antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe on YouTube, share everything around. But I'll talk to you after the weekend. Thanks for listening.